Hey guys, I hope you are doing well this week. Most of you are probably watching this on a Wednesday, and I hope your Wednesday is going well. Somehow it seems like when I am in lockdown, time just kind of stands still and I lose track of which day it is. But it was good to get out a little bit today and to deliver some food and to connect with some friends. And my wife, Mrs. Latin, the crazy chicken lady, picked up some new chicks today from L&M. So I brought those home for her, 3 little red chicks, and we're excited about that. She has lots of chickens and lots of eggs, but she still wants more because that's the way chickens are. I guess she thinks they're cool. And since she thinks they're cool, I think they're cool. And that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. So we are starting now chapter 7 of Chickadee, the book by Louise Erdrich. It was exciting to see that some of you had tuned in and commented on our Google Classroom and looked at the video, but nobody did my Kahoot last week. So I'm going to repost that one. And I wanted to be clear, I'll say this when I post it on Google Classroom, but I wanted to emphasize this is not a grade. You're going to get a lot of the words wrong, but just like we do in the classroom, we run through the quiz once, we talk about the words, we look at them in detail, and then we can go back over them again. So please take the Kahoot, explore the words, look at what I've highlighted in the text, and then we'll come back and do it again and keep learning together. So without further ado, and no, I don't know what an ado is, but without further ado, let's start reading chapter 7. Chapter 7, The Chase. Chickadee's dream was frightening in the first place. It was a nightmare. A huge black flying turtle had chased him through trees and over rocks. Chickadee had been just about to wake when a smothering hand was clapped over his mouth and he was suddenly somewhere else. The last thing he saw was a tiny flare of light inside his family wigwam. Then nothing. All was darkness. He made sounds as he was hauled up, swung around, thumped down, but those sounds were no more than panicked whines. He was sure nobody heard him. And all that was to come, he would fix on that little moment he'd seen the flare of light. He would wish and wish that he'd bitten the hand of Babiche or shoved a stick in the eye of Babiche. He wished he had awakened sooner and managed to grab the feet of his brother, who would have shouted the alarm. But everything happened swiftly, brutally. Now, tied in a sack, Chickadee was slung across a thick blanket on the back of a horse. He thought it was one of the brown horses that Babiche and Baptiste had arrived on. They were galloping away before Chickadee could really make sense of things. It was all too fast, all too strange, all like part of the dream. It was as if the dream had come true, and he was snatched into the air by the flying black turtle. Chickadee was terrified, but as he was held tight against the woolly vest of Babiche, sitting on a comfortable blanket and enveloped in a dark sack, he also began to get sleepy again. I may as well sleep, thought Chickadee. No sense worrying about things now. If I wiggle hard, I'll just fall off. I am certainly taken captive. If I sleep now, I'll be better able to handle what happens when this horse finally stops. As soon as Anamikins and Two Strike found out what had happened, they decided to start out. The family would band together to find Chickadee. Fishtail would help the women on the trail. Anamikins took some fresh maple sugar, dried fish, his rifle, ammunition, and a blanket roll. Omakayas and Anamikins tried to be brave for each other, but when they said goodbye, their eyes swelled with tears. I will not rest until I find him, said Anamikins. I will bring our boy home. I will not rest until he is with us again, said Omakayas. She struggled for breath. It felt like a stick was breaking inside her chest. Chickadee's parents clung to each other fiercely. Then Anamikins turned away, hiding his face, and strode away quickly. Two Strike stood before Omakayas. The mighty woman was ready for anything. She had a small sack of flour, her rifle, ammunition, her bow, a quiver of arrows, her skinning knife, her carving knife, her tobacco knife, her whittling knife, and 2 extra emergency knives she kept hidden in her leggings. Although as children they had disliked each other, Omakayas and Two Strike had become as close as sisters as they grew older. Two Strike was grateful to Omakayas and Angeline for bringing up Zosie, whom she loved but didn't know how to care for. Omakayas appreciated the fierce energy of Two Strike and believed that she had inherited the magnificent spirit of Old Tallow, the much-beloved old woman who had hunted bears with a spear and worn the yellow feather of a flicker in her hat. Two Strike dressed in an unusual fashion too, but that was not the main resemblance. The resemblance was attitude. Both Two Strike and Old Tallow had no time for fools or for civilization. They preferred to live alone in the woods and had gotten rid of their husbands as quickly as possible. They had no time for work that women usually did, but preferred to hunt. They were hard and bitter on the outside, but when it came to children, their hearts were soft. "I will hunt those 2 men who stole your Chickadee, you can be sure. I will destroy them," said Two Strike. She made a fist. When Two Strike smiled, there was something wild and frightening in her eyes. Macoons, who stood behind his mother, was glad that Two Strike loved them. He was happy that their family was under her protection. He would have hated to be either Babiche or Baptiste and face the wrath of his father, his grandfather, and Two Strike. "Miigwech, my sister," said Omakayas. She reached out and put her arms around Two Strike's shoulder. Although Two Strike stood stiff as a tree in her sister's embrace, it was clear that she was touched. She sniffled loudly, then lifted her voice in a ringing war cry that tingled down Macoon's spine. Besides Omakayas, only Zozie dared embrace Two Strike. And once that was done, this woman of tremendous strength loped along, sworn to find Chickadee. In a state of sorrow and anxiety, the rest of the family packed up their camp and prepared to follow. If they lost the trail, the priest had persuaded them all to meet in the biggest settlement for hundreds of miles, the place where Omakayas' brother, Quill, lived, a place called Pembina. Chapter 8. Booyah. On and on the horses galloped. Sometimes Chickadee woke and heard the horses picking their way along or plodding through what seemed like mushy ground. Sometimes the horses stopped and he could hear them chewing. It was warm and dark in the sack, so he always fell asleep again. The horses were good runners and had the will and spirit of the best of their kind. Babiche and Baptiste were hard men, but they were tender where their horses were concerned. So what Chickadee sensed from inside his mail sack was that although the horses galloped hard, they were also rested from time to time and were allowed to graze when they came across melted areas of rich winter grass. They came through the Pembina Hills and even managed to cross the Red River. It was in that perilous time just before the ice broke. But Chickadee slept through that crossing. He was asleep when the horses stopped. Then, suddenly, he was in the air again, thrown off the saddle. He was still in the sack. Chickadee woke as he was falling and had no way to brace himself. He rolled over and over before hitting the earth. Luckily, the snow where he landed was still soft, and Baptiste quickly untied the sack and let him out. The light was blinding at first, after the darkness in the sack. Chickadee rubbed his eyes and looked around. Where were the trees? Where were the hills? And again, where were the trees? There was nothing to see as far as his eyes could reach. This was the plains. It was Booyah, the place where the Dakota people live. It was the Red River Valley. It was Pembina country. Chickadee had heard about the plains. Others in his family had been to the plains, but nothing had prepared Chickadee for the sight of such emptiness. He whirled around, panicked by the vast sky. Baptiste was ducking into a small log cabin. Babiche was taking the 2 brown horses toward a shanty built of pole logs and mud. There was a great hay pile next to it, nibbled all the way around the bottom by rabbits. As they passed the pile, the horses reached out their long necks and swiped a matted clump of hay to chew. Baptiste came out of the cabin. "The mice have eaten everything again," he cried. "Get over here," yelled Babiche to Chickadee. "Now you'll learn to make yourself useful. If you don't," he leered, his big yellow teeth dripping with spit, "we will chop you up and feed you to our horses. They love the meat of little boys." The 2 mild brown horses looked over their shoulders, their eyes reproachful. They didn't look like they ate little boys, though, thought Chickadee, but he hurried over to the makeshift cabin anyway. "What do you want me to do?" Babiche swung his big fist lazily at Chickadee, and Chickadee ducked. Next time you ask that, my fist will connect with your head. You do what a servant does. Chickadee saw a long branch with sticks whittled out and pegged to the ends. He went over and grabbed it. He looked at Babiche, who made digging and pitching motions with his arms. Chickadee began to dig up the horse manure on the dirt floor. It was half frozen, but he managed to move a small pile out the door into a heap behind the barn. While he worked at this, the two brothers bumbled about their cabin, yelling about the mice. "Get in here!" Baptiste yelled at last. Chickadee ran to the cabin. It was dark inside. There were only 3 small openings for light, each covered with a piece of oiled paper. It was almost like being in that sack again. When Chickadee's eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw that there were heaps of furs and blankets on the floor. There was a small round tin barrel set on legs with a pipe running out of it. Next to it, there were piles of dried brown circles of frozen stuff. It was the first time Chickadee had ever seen buffalo dung or buffalo chips. "Start a fire," growled Baptiste. The two brothers stomped out, arguing which of them would take the first shift to deliver the mail. The mail rider would arrive from St. Paul, said Baptiste, and he had ridden first last time. "But I rode last," said Babiche, "so that means I rode last." "Which means you should go first," said Baptiste. "No, it means I am still tired out," said Babiche. "Let's send the servant," said Baptiste. "You are funny, my brother," Babiche laughed. "He would get lost in no time. Our ignorant servant doesn't know where to go." "He doesn't know how to make a fire either," said Baptiste in a sudden rage. "He is useless. I will hit him over the head and be done with it." "Wait," said Babiche. "Look." Chickadee had moistened a small chip of the buffalo dung with kerosene from the bottom of the brother's lamp. He'd seen a lamp like this before in a trading store and knew that the oil worked like fat. He began with the small chip and blew the ember carefully to life, then added bit after bit. The dung smoked, but burned quite well when the fire got hot. "Maybe he is some use to us yet," said Baptiste. "Let's get our tasty meat and flour, my brother. Let's have our servant make us some booyah." Suddenly, Baptiste broke out in song. "Booyah, booyah, it makes the mischief strong. Straight to the brain, he never has to strain. Fill up his belly, make him sweet as jelly. Make his hair grow thick, make his mind so quick. Booyah!" Babiche laughed so hard his face swelled red. "Oh, you are too funny, my brother," he choked. Doubled over, he could barely point out the flour tin and the chunks of old, dried-out, questionable meat that Chickadee would use in making the trapper's stew. Although he had never heard the word booyah, Chickadee knew from looking at the bottom of the kettle on the stove just what the brothers expected of him. The old stuff was stuck to the bottom and covered with mouse droppings. Even the mice had failed to eat it. Baptiste told him to add the new stuff on top of the old stuff and boil it all together with melted snow. Chickadee tried to scrape out the mice droppings, but Baptiste grinned and said, "Leave him in there, servant. We don't have pepper to season it with." So, Chickadee filled the kettle with snow. When the snow melted, he boiled some of the old moose and squirrel meat, and he wrapped up what other meat the brothers had managed to save from the mice. He stirred in the flour and boiled it all some more. At the end, Baptiste dropped in a whole dead mouse he'd found. Chickadee just kept the booyah kettle boiling. At last, Baptiste took a spoonful and declared the stew was finished. There were 2 bowls and 2 spoons. The brothers divided up the booyah into the bowls, used the spoons, and left Chickadee to scrape the leavings from the pot with a stick. As he sat on the icy dirt floor of the miserable cabin, eating the awful stuff that kept life in the sons of Zigag, several thoughts came to Chickadee. Bejig 1. The mouse tails weren't so bad, but the feet were hard to chew. Nij 2. He would do exactly as the brothers said. Niswi 3. He would pretend that he enjoyed being their servant. That way, they would let down their guard so he could escape. Niwin 4. He would figure out where to escape to. Outside, everything looked the same. Miles and miles of empty, snowy plains. There were no landmarks, nothing but the same horizon all around. Snow would quickly fill in the tracks they had left. He would have to be clever. Nanan 5. He would take care to avoid their fists and feet. And he would not think of Macoons, of Zosie, of his mother or father, until all was dark and the Booyah stuffed brothers could not see his tears. Night came soon enough. Although the brothers argued about whether a servant was allowed to sleep near the masters or out with the horses, they ended up giving him one blanket and allowing him to curl up beside the stove so that he could be all the quicker to make their breakfast.
"You will rise at dawn," said Baptiste, "while we are still enjoying our sleeps. You will make our breakfast, Booyah."
"How shall I make that?" asked Chickadee. Babiche raised his fist. "Same as the dinner, Booyah?" asked Chickadee quickly.
"Of course, you scrap of stinking hide," said Babiche.
Baptiste began to sing again.
"Booyah, Booyah, the way to start the day. If your stew is full of hair, just spit it out and swear. If your stew smells like feet, there's more of it to eat. The worse it gives you gas, the better you run fast. White people say it's muck, but it brings the mischief's luck. Booyah!"
"You are funny, my brother," Babiche said, weeping with pleasure. In the dark, curled in his blanket, Chickadee mouthed the words that he realized would be repeated at least 20 times each day. If he ever got back to Macoons, he would never, ever say those words.
"You are funny, my brother."
Thinking about Macoons led to nothing but tears, and Chickadee could feel them breaking from inside of him, even as the huge brothers, falling into their sleep, began a soft snoring that deepened and then widened into an avalanche of noise. Chapter 9. Into the Plains. As Omachaias trudged along, following the trail that Dede, Anamikins, and then Two Strike had made, she realized that if they kept going west, they would be leaving the shelter and safety of the woods and hills. They would travel out of the trees and rolling prairie into the flat, broad plains. Anamikins had been there on buffalo hunts, but she never had. It frightened her to think that Chickadee was out there, somewhere, in such unfamiliar territory. Fishtail scouted for the little party. Angeline, Yellow Kettle, and Zosie made sure that the dogs pulled along their packs and gave Nokomis a ride when her legs were tired. Omachaias kept Macoons near her at all times. She could hardly bear to let him out of her sight. On and on the family walked. Nokomis made her way along slowly with her walking stick, holding Zosie's shoulder. The dogs were fitted with harnesses, and they carried the kettles and extra clothing and rolls of bark for shelter. They also carried the big packs of furs that the family would sell in Pembina. Father Ganin had decided to go to Pembina, where he was supposed to meet up with another priest who was starting a school. Father Ganin had promised to find Omachaias' brother, the twins' Uncle Quill. He would put out the word that the Gigog brothers had stolen Chickadee. Someone in that big town was sure to know where those brothers lived. As they walked along, the air grew warmer, the sky darker, the clouds lower, and bits of snow began to swirl dizzily around them. "There's a spring snowstorm coming," said Nokomis. "I can feel it all through my bones." "Let's make camp," said Omachaias. Although a spring blizzard would melt away quickly, it would be dangerous while it lasted. Sometimes, on the plains, these fast-moving snowstorms occurred even in the beginning of summer. Omachaias had heard about their force, and now she was to experience it. The trees had grown scarce, and the hills were only mild bumps. They picked the best shelter they could find and set up the birch bark house. Zosie and Omachaias worked quickly and made their bark secure with straps of twine. They heaped snow against the sides for insulation. Nokomis went inside to start the fire. The snow stopped for a moment, and then the storm hit with a huge blast of wind. The cruel gust took the entire house into the air. Off it went, sailing into snowy nothingness, tumbling over the icy ground, bouncing off the hard drifts with nothing to stop it. This was the last time the family would ever make a house of birch bark. Their house blew away, and they never saw it again. Such houses were for the woods. They were now people of the Great Plains, but they hadn't learned yet how to live there. And there was Nokomis, striker in her hand, nursing a tiny circle of flame that immediately went out. "Get into the fur packs!" shouted Omachaias. Each pack of furs was bundled tightly with sinew, but by pulling out the middle furs, each one of them could wiggle in. Nokomis and Macoons got in first. The snow began to drive against them, but Omachaias and Zosie tied the packs together before they got in themselves. The dogs curled near, hiding their noses in the warm curls of their tails. All together in a heap, the family waited out the storm. Ahead of them, on the banks of the Red River where the snow was deep, Two Strike and Anamikins had caught up with Miquam. Together, the three made a snow cave and curled up in their blankets to sleep there. And that's the end of chapter 9. Kind of sad, kind of exciting. And what do you think of the decisions, those 5 points that he made, that Chickadee made? I want to hear from you, and I will follow up with some questions in our Google Classroom. So listen in, tell me what you think, and we will be in touch. Thank you.